Is there another humanitarian crisis building up here in Bosnia and Herzegovina?
I think we first need to contextualize just to see what is happening here. Last year we had 735 entries in Bosnia and Herzegovina of irregular migrants or asylum seekers. This year we are already up to 21,000. So clearly the number of migrants that have arrived in Bosnia and Herzegovina has increased significantly. The authorities were not prepared for that, and the main challenge was the lack of accommodation. Also have to emphasize that these are transit migrants. We currently have about 4,000 to 4,500 people still on the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which means also that it's a successful route from the migrant perspective. 3 out of 4 migrants have managed to continue onwards to Croatia, Slovenia, Austria and Italy, where it is that they want to go. There was a humanitarian crisis, and people were living in very difficult humanitarian conditions, specifically in Bihac and Velika Kladuša, because of the lack of official accommodation, which created problems for the migrants who were in insufficient accommodation, but also for the local population. These are small cities, and these cities certainly see 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 migrants in their daily lives, and they are visible everywhere. Not that most of the migrants are like everyone else, they don't create problems, but the perception of insecurity was clearly an issue.
How do you explain that the Bosnian authorities reacted so slowly on that?
First of all, we have to emphasize that Bosnia and Herzegovina is a decentralized state. So when you look at, for example, accommodation in Bihac, you have to deal with the state government, the central authorities, the authorities of the federation on which the territory of Bihac is located, the cantonal authorities, the Unasana canton where Bihac is located, and then the local municipality. So you can immediately see, if you have this type of setup, that any response for anything is going to take time. Secondly, we were in the middle of an election year where politicians are fighting to get re-elected, and where the collaboration of people from different political parties is, like in any country, fairly complicated. Thirdly, of course, Bosnia and Herzegovina has limited financial resources. The international funding has come online, but it came online in July and June, by which time we already had, for example, in Velika Kladuša and Bihac, 4 or 5 months of migrants staying there. So that also somewhat slowed down the response. And then finally, again, I think we need to contextualize this response in the sense that Bosnia has been dealing with, as I said, since January. Other countries in the region, elsewhere in Europe, have been dealing with this for a much longer time. Yes, maybe sometimes with higher numbers, but also, for example, in Greece with a lot more international financial donor support, again from the European Union. And we see that even in those countries today that are more centralized, have more resources, have been dealing this for multiple years, we still have people living in inhumane conditions. In my own city in Brussels, 400 or 500 people are still living in a park every night. So what I think that there is going to be the need for Bosnia and Herzegovina to look at itself and see what is the lessons learned in the terms of the crisis response. What do we do if there's a crisis again in 2 or 3 years' time? But at the same time, I think it's not as bad as it is sometimes being portrayed, also by the national media, I have to say.
How do you explain that so many people rushed suddenly towards the Croatian border?
I think a few factors. The first is that through my field teams of IOM in the Western Balkans, Macedonia, Serbia, Montenegro, Albania, but also in Bosnia and Herzegovina, it is clear that there were rumors circulating amongst migrants that Croatia would open its official borders to let the migrants through. While it's difficult to prove, my sense is that this message was also parted by smugglers who wanted to make sure that their businesses kept on going. That's the first element. The second element, I think, is that people are getting nervous with the winter approaching. As I said earlier, I think most of the migrants that are here look at Bosnia and Herzegovina simply as a transit country, and they realize that unless they try now, they may be stuck here for a couple of months when the weather turns bad, when there is snow and they can no longer cross. So that's another element, I think, that happened. And then, of course, it is also a mass phenomenon. We have a couple of leaders in the migrants who say, let's do this. Other people follow.
There was quite some tough criticism against you coming from NGOs, saying you and your organization are not doing your job. How do you react on this criticism?
I think that there is sometimes a bit of a confusion as to what the role of IOM and other international organizations is. It is up to the authorities to decide where migrants can be accommodated. Bosnia and Herzegovina is a state that functions, has its difficulties and challenges, but I cannot simply go to a place and say, okay, IOM has decided to put up a center, let's put up tents or open up a building where migrants can stay. For that you rely on a political decision-making process.
Do we observe that there's a new Western Balkan route for migrants emerging right now?
Well, I think it is right to say that the Western Balkans, a new Western Balkans route has opened, in the sense that we've had 20,000, 21,000 people since the beginning of the year, 4,500 are here. That means that 3 out of 4 migrants have managed to cross irregularly into Croatia and then onwards. So yes, a new Western Balkans route is open. At the same time, I think we have to be cautious not to dramatize it. A lot of the people that we're seeing traveling to Bosnia and Herzegovina, they were already on the Western Balkans route. They were either in Greece, they were in Bulgaria, they were in Serbia, they were in Macedonia, they were in Albania, Montenegro to a lesser degree. And these people have simply decided that this is their chance to get to the part of the EU that they want to go. And they've used this opportunity of this quasi-open situation that we've had with Croatia. So not all the people are new. There was one group that was new, and that was related to the Serbian visa-free regime with Iran, where we suddenly saw an influx of Iranians coming, frankly, by plane from Tehran to Belgrade because they were cheap flights. But that route has now been closed because the visa-free regime has been suspended. So that was literally a new route in the sense that there were new people, they were coming from different destinations than before. But so yes, we have an open route in the sense that people can still travel through with a reasonable degree of success from their perspective. It's a mixed picture when you look at the actual people, because a lot of those people were already on the Western Balkans route before.
Where are those people coming from mainly? And follow-up question, are those mainly migrants or refugees? What would be the most appropriate word to be used?
When we look at the nationalities, first of all, we have to always be careful because this is all self-declared. 99% of the people that arrive here say, true or not, that they have no documents. You look at the nationalities, roughly 35% Pakistanis, the highest number of people that are here. We have 20% Afghanis, 20% Syrians. Syrians, I have some doubts of how many of these people are actually Syrians, because there's also a lot of people from North Africa who self-declare as Syrian. We have North Africans here, people from Iraq, and then some smaller nationalities, including some Libyans and self-declared Palestinians. Now, it is difficult for me, of course, everyone has the right to go through an asylum process, and that will then determine whether a person is an economic migrant or a refugee. Now, my sense would be, without wanting to prejudge those procedures, that we're looking at a population that I would say 80 to 85% are people that are economic migrants rather than people in need of international protections. It doesn't mean that they are not vulnerable, because of course a lot of people have been on the road for 2 or 3 years and have become vulnerable as they move forward. The second point I think to make that is important is that while of course we cannot accept all economic migrants in Europe, there is no it seems to me wrong from a moral, ethical perspective to say there are good people, which are the refugee ones, and there are bad people that are the economic migrants. I think that discussion in the Western Balkans is particularly relevant when you see that the last 4 years in Bosnia and Herzegovina, 150,000 people have left here as economic migrants. So I don't think that we should give a moral judgment to people who try to improve their lives. You can both say we don't accept them if they don't fall within the categories that we allow in our countries, but you don't have to vilify people simply because they are economic migrants, because people try to improve their lives, and there is nothing wrong with that. It doesn't mean that they should have the right to stay if they don't have the right documents, etc., etc. But I think it's important not to fall into that trap to say there's good people and there's bad people, because there is no moral judgment in there. It's a legal judgment that determines who can stay and who cannot stay, but it's not more than that.
You're a man of long experience. What would be your direct, straightforward recommendation to Croatian authorities and to European Union authorities how to handle this crisis?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm best placed to make recommendations to Zagreb, but I think maybe broader to the European Union, and I think it is already happening. But there needs to be increased political collaboration between the EU and the Western Balkans countries on this migration issue, because frankly, this is an EU issue, because people are coming, as I said earlier, from the EU and they're going to another part of the EU. So they are using the Western Balkans as simply as a pathway through from one part of the EU to the other. So I think it's very important that the EU continues doing what they're doing, which is providing financial support, but we need to also sit together and strategically, following up on some of the documents that have already been made, to see how are we going to make sure that the Western Balkans are part of any migration plan of the European Union to the extent that they want going forward. I'll give you one example. The issue of returns. We have a program, Assisted Voluntary Return, where people who want to return, they can go back voluntarily. That's not a problem to organize from the Western Balkans. But where the Western Balkans have a huge problem is that if people do apply for asylum here and they stay and they get a negative decision, there is no capacity, not technical, but no political capacity to return people to countries of origin. when Bosnia-Herzegovina, when Germany tries to return people, for example, to a country like Pakistan, it has huge difficulties, huge challenges. There were recent news reports about how difficult it is for Finland to return Iraqis back to Iraq, people that do not have right to refugee status. So it's even more complicated for Bosnia-Herzegovina or for Serbia, Macedonia, because they don't have the political clout or influence to convince those countries to take their nationals back. And that is, for example, in terms of a return framework, which is part of any migration policy. I think closer political collaboration is required. The last message is that I think we need to step up the efforts of the fight against the smugglers. Smugglers and also actually human trafficking, because there is a lot of people that are making a lot of money out of these migrants. And some smugglers, if I can put it in that way, deliver the services that they promise, but some of the others, and many of them, actually just exploit migrants as they go forward. And that is something that is, again, not something that is in the power of the Western Balkan countries alone. There needs to be close coordination and cooperation between the European countries and the Western Balkans in terms of investigation and prosecution.
What is your recommendation? What should be done to handle the problem with the people smugglers? How this should be handled? What should be done?
Well, I'm not a law enforcement officer, but I do believe that there have been a lot of conferences, but I think operationally these conferences need to be translated into action. And I think you could think about joint investigative teams that are EU, Western Balkans working together on cases. It happens on an ad hoc basis, but I think more needs to be invested, more resources need to be allocated in fighting those smugglers, it seemed to me. And there is a related issue which is more complicated to discuss maybe in Europe. And that is, migration policy has really many facets. And we were discussing earlier offline that some of the Pakistani nationals say that they are going to work in Italy in agriculture. Now, part of the response to reduce irregular migration is also to regularize labor in sectors like agriculture in many countries in Europe, for example. If you have demand for labor, regularize it so that people can come with an official piece of paper, maybe for a short period of time. But if you allow in your own countries this black market of labor to exist, well, we will continue to have irregular migrants because they're the ones that are being employed by nationals of those countries. So that is also part of it. I think there we need to look at on the demand side. People are not coming to claim unemployment benefit. People are coming to work. So if there is a grey economy that pulls people inwards, how can we regularize that? Maybe that requires more legal avenues for people to come to work, for example, in agriculture in Belgium or in Italy, whatever it is. That's not for me to say. But that is also part of that, because as long as there's a demand, as long as people can actually stay in Europe on an irregular basis for 20 years or 30 years and do work, people will continue to come. So then law enforcement alone is not enough.
What is the reaction of the local people around here? What did you observe?
I mean, I think for me the biggest thing to come out of this for Bosnia-Herzegovina is, Bosnia-Herzegovina has the reputation of being a divided country. People listen to political rhetorics and say, oh, there's Croats, Serbs and Bosniaks. Now, when you look at the migration crisis, how the local population has responded, they stepped in where initially the state authorities were absent. It has been, to my mind, the vast majority has been with huge amounts of solidarity, understanding, hospitality, and independent, whether people were Bosniaks, Croats, Serbs, middle class, poor, or rich people. And that shows to me, I think, a shared set of fundamental values that exist across Bosnia-Herzegovina that I guess we would call fundamental European values that exist already in this country, despite the divisive political rhetoric. So to my mind, for Bosnia, that is something very positive to come out of this. I have one story that I like to tell, and that's more about social class. When I was in Sarajevo, we had migrants here in the park. And one night I was standing there in my suit, and there's a guy who drives up in a brand new Porsche Cayenne with two small children in the back. And he asked me, can I distribute something to the migrants? And I said, yes, but aren't you worried for your car? He said, no, let's do it. So he distributes this with the Porsche Cayenne, had his kids to show his kids what human solidarity means. Now I can tell you, in my own country, someone who drives a Porsche Cayenne doesn't go anywhere near an unregulated migration camp. And it's a small anecdote, but this is how the population has responded. As a final point on this, Bihac and Velika Kladuša have been suffering from large numbers of migrants in irregulated or unregulated fashion on their territory. Every day we receive donations from people. The NGO that does the food here with Bayram, they received 80 tons of meat from Sarajevo citizens and companies for the migrants. So there has been huge solidarity, and that I think is really an important story to bring out. There haven't been any extreme right-wing anti-migrant demonstrations anywhere in the country. Even the demonstrations in Bihać were not against the migrants, they were against the state in terms of they're not doing enough to help us. But there were very few people who were saying what they would say in my own country, migrants out, for example. So I think these are very important things to bring out for the international audience, because it's different from the image of Bosnia and Herzegovina as this somewhat backward country that has all these divisions on the ground and so on.
Is there any risk that the situation we faced in 2015 could repeat itself?
Well, my answer would be, of course, it's difficult to predict the future, but I would think it's very unlikely. I think, first of all, I think if you look at the figures of actual arrivals in Europe this year, despite the fact maybe of the images of people sitting in camps around Europe, that number has actually gone down significantly. So first thing. Second thing, I think also that people, for example, Syrians, let's talk about Syrians in Turkey, they have settled in Turkey. They have access to education, access to work, access to health. The Turkish government has done huge efforts to try to integrate to a certain degree, even if only temporarily, of this population in Turkey. So I think that people are less likely to move because they have a lot to give up. Thirdly, I also think, and that's less reported on, but we are starting to see small irregular movements from the EU back to Turkey, back to other places in the Middle East, because I think people came with a set of expectations that were unrealistic and that they were not met. Also, and finally I have to mention this, of course the border controls have increased significantly since then, and the European collaboration and coordination has been stepped up significantly. So I don't think that we need to be afraid of that. I do think that we need to at some point look at what are the real needs in Europe in terms of migration? What legal channels do we, instead of using the asylum process for everything, we should look more creatively at legal channels for migration. I know it's easy for me to say because I'm an international civil servant, I don't need to get elected, but one way of combating irregular migration is to open legal channels in areas where there is real work. And then you can start also looking at whether making sure that the people that are coming are the people that you need for your labor market and that you can actually offer a job. And that needs to be part of that longer term solution. But a repeat of 2015, I really don't see this happening. I'm really afraid that sometimes people are taking these perilous journeys based upon dreams that are really very far from the reality that they will face if they get to their country of destination, if they get to their country of destination.